Okay, the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking or asking a question. Consistent with HRES 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate any background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing to discuss diversity and inclusion at the State Department. Today, less than 4% of career diplomats serving as ambassadors are Black or Latino. For comparison, more than 30% of Americans are Black or Latino. This disparity is staggering. One of my priorities in Congress is improving the diversity and inclusion of women and minorities in U.S. foreign policy. I believe that the people who represent America should be representative of the American people. And we have an opportunity at this moment in history to bring about real structural changes. The murder of George Floyd by the police has sparked a movement for justice, not only on the streets of Washington, D.C., but also in places around the world like Berlin, Paris, Tokyo, Seoul, and so many others. And let's not forget, we're in the middle of a pandemic that's killed more than 400,000 people, infected over 7 million, and decimated the global economy. People across the globe are protesting systemic racism. That's also true of America's diplomats. Foreign service officers and former U.S. ambassadors, particularly Black diplomats, are speaking up about not being treated with respect and also calling out a good old boy culture that's held them back. Now is the time to listen and take action. Today, we'll hear testimony from San Antonio native, my hometown, Jason Baer, Director of the International Affairs and Trade Team at U.S. Government Accountability Office. In February, his team of independent investigators published a report showing that the State Department's efforts to increase diversity have fallen woefully short, despite pronouncements from the Trump administration and Secretary Pompeo to the contrary. For example, people of color in the civil service, quote, had statistically significantly lower odds of promotion than white men. I will also want to say that this is not just a phenomenon of the Trump administration. We also have to look at the longer years where this has been going on. The GAO report makes clear with compelling evidence that diversity and inclusion is a major challenge at the U.S. State Department. We know the diversity of diplomats is an issue. We have the data to prove it. Now the question is, how do we move forward and fix it? That's why we're also joined by Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winsaley. She's a 30-year diplomat, the longest serving U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Malta, and was the first woman to lead a foreign diplomatic mission in Saudi Arabia. She's one of America's foremost experts on foreign policy and also diverse leadership development. Diversity is a long-standing challenge at the State Department, but we simply haven't made enough progress. For example, recruiting from historically Black colleges and Hispanic-serving universities is necessary and important, but alone it's insufficient. I've been a huge champion of the Rangel and Pickering Fellowships. I wrote the FAIR Act, which expanded those programs and was signed into law by President Obama. But hiring is only the first step. Just as important as hiring is retention, and that includes exit interviews to understand why people leave the State Department. Ultimately, we need a fair process with minimal bias that enables women and people of color to be promoted to positions of power, to move up the ladders. And that takes leadership from the top to set the tone and build an inclusive culture. I'm proud that we're joined by one of those leaders, Ambassador Peter Romero. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ecuador and as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and at the time was the highest ranking Hispanic diplomat in the Foreign Service. The right leadership with a long-term commitment to change can make a real difference. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo are responsible for responsible for taking on this challenge. I hope and I believe that they can. Representation matters not only because it's fair and just, but also because it leads to better outcomes. Foreign policy informed by diverse experiences will be smarter, more strategic, and build relationships that ultimately produce better results for our country. Thank you. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses, and I now yield to my colleague from New York, our ranking member, Representative Zeldin, for any comments that he may have.
Well, thank you to Chairman Castro, and congratulations on your new role as chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today virtually to discuss more ways that we can diversify the State Department. Over the past 20 years, every administration has worked to create a more diverse workforce. To represent the United States to the world, the State Department should have a workforce that reflects the diversity of our country. I am pleased with the department's continued commitment to increasing diversity with a revised 4-year 2020 to 2024 Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Plan. This plan identifies ways to promote practices to recruit, retain, and train an elite workforce that reflects the nation's diversity. Recruiting beyond the Washington, D.C. Beltway is an important starting point. One of the best ways to do that is to increase outreach efforts by encouraging current civil and foreign service employees of the department to go out into their communities and talk about their work. In addition to the ongoing diversity fellowship programs, the department has piloted a volunteer recruiter course for employees to undertake this task on their own time and serve as a force multiplier for diversity outreach. Nearly 250 employees have been trained. This past February, the GAO finalized a thorough review of the State Department's diversity efforts and published a report on how to address potential barriers to equal opportunity in its workforce. We are pleased to have one of the authors of this report with us today to speak to us in more detail on the findings. While some of the statistics in this report were disappointing, there are a couple major takeaways that I want to highlight. First, we cannot deny there has been real progress over the past 10 to 15 years, particularly with diversity in the foreign service. According to that report, the number of racial and ethnic minorities in the foreign service has increased from 17 to 24% between 2002 and 2018. Additionally, the data in this report indicates racial and ethnic minorities are promoted at lower levels in the civil service. Promotions in any job can be attributed to a number of unknown factors. As Deputy Assistant Secretary Perez told this subcommittee in a hearing last year, federal agencies were not focused on diversity 15 to 20 years ago, so there's only a small pool of women and minorities in the senior ranks. Overall, despite these numbers, there have been real gains. The State Department recognizes the problem and has shown its commitment to increasing diversity hires. I would also be interested in having the administration come to speak on their new plan at a later date. I thank all of the witnesses for being here. I thank our colleagues for joining today's hearing. I yield back to the chair and say thank you for hosting today's hearing today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Zeldin, and also the Ranking Member and I think a few others from the committee had a chance to do a roundtable with some of the affinity groups on this very issue. So I want to thank him and the others for engaging the groups at the State Department on this very important issue. And now I want to introduce our distinguished witnesses. Our witnesses for today's hearing are Jason Baer with the Government Accountability Office, and Ambassador Peter Rometto and Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, both retired diplomats with the American Academy of Diplomacy. Thank you for being here today. I'll now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. I'll first call on Mr. Baer for his testimony. Mr. Baer?
Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Zeldin, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. As a native San Antonian, it's an honor to testify before your subcommittee, Chairman Castro. My remarks this afternoon are based on GAO's January 2020 report on diversity at the State Department. States Diversity Strategic Plan says, as the face of America overseas, we want to represent the country's richness and diversity. That commitment certainly takes on heightened importance in light of current events in our country. As protests regarding racial justice have proliferated around the globe, there's no better time to reflect on the diversity of the State Department, which represents America to the rest of the world. Against that backdrop, I will discuss the key results of GAO's analysis of 17 years' worth of personnel data covering more than 42,000 State Department employees. The overarching theme of our report is that state needs to take additional steps to address barriers to workforce diversity. Specifically, I'll discuss 1, data on the diversity of states' workforce, 2, variances in promotion outcomes for different groups, and 3, states reporting on diversity issues. With regard to data on diversity in states' workforce, my first key message is that there has been a small overall increase in the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities at state. Overall, the share of racial or ethnic minorities in states' workforce grew from 28% in 2002 to 32% in 2018. That growth was driven by growth in the Foreign Service, which increased from 17% racial or ethnic minorities to 24%. However, that overall growth hides the decline in African Americans, which shrank from 17% to 15% due to shifts in the civil service. Further, the overall proportion of women in states' workforce decreased slightly from 44% to 43%. Growth in the Foreign Service was more than offset by a decline in the civil service, which went from 61% female to 54%.
Jason, I apologize for interrupting. We're having some technical issues. I just wanted to flag in the live stream and to flag that for the members as well that are on here.
Okay. You want me to pause, or should we continue on with the oral statement?
Chairman, I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware that the live stream had technical issues and for you to be aware of that.
Do we need? Why don't we recess for 3 minutes and see if we can get the technical part back up? If it's a situation with your connection, then maybe you can dial back in and we can take your testimony after that. But give us a few minutes to figure it out.
Okay, sounds great. I'll go on mute again.
Sure. My apologies to the members and the staff and the witnesses.
Just so that our witnesses and members are aware, the technical issues we are trying to fix are a YouTube bandwidth issue because there are multiple hearings happening right now and the audio is cutting in and out on YouTube. And for us to be in accordance with rules, the public needs to be able to watch the hearing and have it be clear. So that's what we are working on right now.
And just an update, y'all. This has been an issue, a challenge today for I think a few of the committees because there's so much work going on right now. Um, Apparently, I guess our video and audio feed is set up through YouTube, and I guess looks like there's some kind of capacity issue, so they're working to fix it. I don't believe we're on video right now. The audio is still going, but I think everybody's muted. So just if y'all could relax for a second, and they're working on fixing it. So. Let's bring the committee back to order. I apologize for the delay, and we'll go back to Mr. Bear to continue his statement.
All right, thank you, Chairman Castro. We were just talking about the change in the proportion of women at the State Department. We also examined the distribution of groups across different ranks in the workforce and identified two notable results. First, the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities was generally much smaller in the higher ranks. For example, in the civil service, racial or ethnic minorities accounted for 65% of employees at the GS-10 level or below, but only 13% of executives. Second, the proportion of women was progressively smaller from the lower to the higher ranks. For instance, in the civil service, women composed 69% of employees at the GS-10 level and below, and 38% of executives. A second key issue we identified is variances in promotion outcomes for different groups. The key message from our analysis is that promotion outcomes were lower for racial or ethnic minorities than for whites at almost every level, from early career to executive. For example, in the civil service, we found that promotion rates from GS-11 through executive rank were 16 to 42% lower for racial or ethnic minorities relative to their white counterparts. Although our analyses do not completely explain the reasons for these differences or establish causal relationships, the results certainly warrant attention both from the State Department and Congress. We also took things a step further and built a statistical model that controlled for factors such as education, length of service, and special language skills that might influence promotion rates. The resulting analysis also found significantly lower promotion outcomes for racial or ethnic minorities through their civil service careers and in the early career for the Foreign Service. My third and final point is that state has identified some diversity issues, but should consider other issues that could indicate potential barriers. Since 2009, states' annual reports to EEOC have identified a total of 11 diversity issues, such as underrepresentation of Hispanics. However, states' employee groups and our data analysis identify that there are more issues that need to be addressed at the State Department. Until state addresses such barriers, they may impede groups across the department. As a result, we recommended that the Secretary of State identify the root causes of diversity issues that could indicate potential barriers to equal opportunity. The State Department concurred, and we will follow up regularly to determine what steps they take to address our recommendation. Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Zeldin, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Baer. And now I want to call on Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley for her testimony. Oh, I think you may still be on mute there.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Castro and Ranking Member Zeldin, for today's focus on what it's going to take to create a truly diverse workforce. The department has lost too many of us because of bias, quiet discrimination, and indifference. The GAO report doesn't try to explain causality, but the numbers speak for themselves. Our problems begin at the beginning with recruiting. Our rigorous testing process brings us smart, educated, and intelligent Foreign Service officers, but it has also welcomed racist, sexist, and those who are indifferent to both. And this moment in America has shown us just how dangerous a culture of indifference can be. A solid start to changing that culture is to require the Board of Examiners, the gatekeepers, to be significantly diverse. A friend of mine was recently pulled from a job of being an assessor for an incoming classes to take a more prestigious job, but his departure left the assessment team with not a single African American. That lack of diversity among gatekeepers can have a huge impact on whether a minority candidate is judged ready to represent America. Success can rest on something as simple as whether a candidate is asked to speak about Tom Wolfe or Ta-Nehisi Coates. Once in, the skills the Foreign and Civil Service care about are clear. In both, we are judged on our leadership skills, our management, and our substantive knowledge. Rated highly on these in the Foreign Service, and your next promotion is yours. But fail to meet those standards, and you will be low-ranked and removed. Now, department leadership says that diversity and inclusion are important, but no one is judged on their ability to help underrepresented officers improve their performance or to secure important assignments. No one gets promoted because they've burnished the quality of decision-making by expanding the diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds brought to the table. No one is held back because their bureau or their embassy or their office or their section lacks inclusion. As this report makes clear, I constantly walked into meetings at the State Department and knew instantly that everyone who should have been at the table was not there. The homogeneity of race and gender around the table is the lived experience of the GAO report. Where the department needs help, where you can help us, is holding themselves accountable. Without accountability for those who select, assign, and promote employees, it will continue to be easy to overlook, leave out, and avoid hiring women and minority officers. To get this right, in the foreign and civil service, every promotion, every job prospect, and assignment must depend, in part, on the ability to ensure inclusion and development of underrepresented talent. Just as I knew my ability to communicate in Arabic would help my supervisor advocate for my next promotion, today's diplomats must know that their mentoring of underrepresented officers, for example, will strengthen their case for promotion. If you want the workforce to care, make it clear it counts. Unfortunately, shaping the department's diversity and inclusion performance sits in many offices, from the Director General to individual bureaus. An empowered Director General can make a difference, but responsibility for increasing diversity is so diffuse that everyone gets to throw up their hands and say, not me, I'm not responsible. No senior official has the responsibility or authority to focus on this foundational issue. The department has implemented several programs to help level the playing field for underrepresented minorities and women, but they often falter under the burden of being seen as affirmative action. My class of 52 had 2 Blacks and 13 women. And I remember attending a happy hour as a new FSO and overhearing a group of my male colleagues derisively speculating on which woman had used the Mustang program to get into the Foreign Service because she couldn't pass the written exam. No one wants to undermine a professional Foreign Service by eliminating a healthy ladder to the senior ranks. But there's no incentive for department-wide, bureau-wide, or individual efforts to improve representation. The saying in the civil service is that women get the training, men get the jobs. Hurdles for experienced and capable civil servants to transfer to the Foreign Service are unnecessarily high. Many individual officers place inclusion as a priority, and I benefited from those officers. I was lucky they saw something in me that pushed them to sponsor me for jobs and promotions. But the building often works against such efforts. When I interviewed to be a DCM for the first time for a Black woman ambassador, I was thrilled. There are always so few, and she was dynamic. And I was certain that my great interview would get me that job. But she told me she did not feel safe in having an all-Black front office, that she felt compelled to select a white male to protect herself. And I thanked her for her honesty, and I meant it. But I am telling you, when I got home that afternoon, I cried. I felt betrayed by a culture that would crush the courage of even those who know how important such courage is. There is a presumption in the department that while all white officers took the written exam and are therefore worthy of being an FSO, and all Black and Hispanic officers likely did not. It is a damaging assumption and burdens Pickering and Rangel fellows who actually belong to the only category of fellows who must take the written exam. We all know that increasing diversity of all kinds among national security professionals improves policy outcomes. I and my success are not unique, but too many like me have not had the same support. We have to institutionalize and expand the successful efforts of individuals because the department can get this right. The talent is there, the ability is there, and the time is now. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for sharing that very powerful story of professional pain and what you experienced. Next, I want to recognize Ambassador Romero for his testimony.
First, let me thank Chairman Castro and Ranking Lee Zeldin for the opportunity to speak to diversity in the State Department and why it matters. At the outset, let me just say that for a more complete reading of my recommendations, please refer to my written testimony. America grapples with social justice and institutional violence towards our African American brothers and sisters. At the same time, the politics of resentment is complicating our ability to come together as we must, as one nation. Certainly, our luster as a beacon of freedom and justice has been tarnished, but it's foolhardy to only rail at our adversaries for taking advantage of our current tumult and weakness. This is what adversaries do. At this crucial inflection point in our history, we must look deeply into the soul of America and commit to fixing institutional biases, whether they are on the streets of our cities and towns or in the offices at state. So why does diversity matter within the ranks of our career Foreign Service practitioners? Our diplomats must represent the diverse composition of our nature. Our power to influence flows from who we are. America has led the way since 1941. We are not only because of our military might or our policy choices and actions, thank God, but it's because of who we are. We are a nation composed of pieces of every other country in the world. It is the American model which not only inspires, but has provided me and others with the ability to walk into a foreign authoritarian's office and demand the release of unjustly imprisoned Americans or people tortured simply for exercising their rights. Our national commitment to form a more perfect union shows our enemies and friends that the U.S. is not done yet. Morale at the State Department is admittedly at a low ebb. One sees more slouch than swagger. Just in the U.S., bias, discrimination, and callousness to staff have plagued the department since its inceptions. It has worsened under the current administration. The department has made considerable efforts to diversify, but Payne, Rangel, and Pickering fellowships have not succeeded in promoting diversity into the senior ranks. In 1977, when I took the oral exam for the Foreign Service, one of my examiners told me, "You passed." And then, thinking he was offering me a compliment, he said, "For a Hispanic, you write well." I think Chairman Castro can relate to this. In conversations with diversity fellows, one gets a sense that while not said out loud, this kind of bias persists in middle management. This is a failure of leadership. Let me focus on a few recommendations. Make mid-level officers accountable for developing all of those supervised. They should be required to set specific diversity and inclusion goals for themselves and be evaluated yearly on them. Create a diversity and inclusion scorecard that measures the success of supervisors in the recruitment, retention, promotion, and professional development. Make it mandatory that rating and reviewing officers of the supervisor reach out to all of those represented in his staff and do 360-degree assessments, employee satisfaction responses. Raise inclusive leadership to the highest level of core competency for supervising officers and make them an absolute requirement in the precepts for promotion. More thoroughly utilize the representatives of the 14 employee affinity groups that Chairman Castro spoke about earlier. And most importantly, vigorously select out all those officers who show an abusive pattern towards staff, regardless of any other personal qualities, influence, or achievements in the service. Develop and implement an adequate system to determine why officers resign. These exit surveys are absolutely essential in identifying systematic patterns that must be addressed. With respect to the last recommendation, a consistent complaint of our minority officers is that their suggestions for new policy initiatives often met with silence or demeaning response by supervisors. Something like, "You're an FS3, you need to just listen." Yes, millennials are impatient and cite the private sector as more welcoming to their ideas. This spirit should be nurtured, not shot down. Every challenge that our country now faces for new approaches and novel ways of dealing with them, these will come from them, not the gray hairs. Now more than ever, the department must cultivate and prize novelty. Quickly on the civil service. The civil service accounts for 41% of state. A sharp narrowing pyramid as you rise in the civil service makes opportunities of upward mobility very difficult. They have chronically complained about the absence of opportunities as overseas postings go unfilled. The American Academy of Diplomacy has recommended an accepted service pilot program, and I'm prepared to talk about that at greater length. A passing note on Pickering, Wrangell, and Payne fellowships. These have worked. We are bringing in just the right people to represent our country in the 21st century. It may be the case, though, that the fellows accepted in these programs as undergraduates cannot compete effectively with their older non-fellow cohort, and I can speak to that if the committee would like. Beyond the moral imperative to better diversify state, there are comparative advantages to doing so. I know this by personal experience. It would give us greater cultural and linguistic competencies, arm us with critical empathy and understanding, all critical tools to influence friend and foe alike, provide us with more uniform decision-making capabilities, and gain the support of all Americans for our men and women that hazard political and physical risks overseas and at home. Finally, I'd like to close by mentioning the passing last week of one of the true stars of the Foreign Service. Ambassador Simon Henshaw was a true leader, mentor, and friend, and he will be truly missed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Romero, and thank all of you for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this meeting, I'll now recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And we'll go through the committee members, and then I know that Congressman Sherman was on. Then we'll go to anybody that's not on the committee, and then perhaps, time permitting, back for a second round. Okay, so I'm going to recognize myself now for my questions. Well, thank you, all of you, for your both enlightening and very powerful and moving testimony about the lack of diversity at the State Department. And it does appear from the GAO report that over the years, there have been more women and minorities who have come in the door, perhaps, but too many that have left, not enough that have been given a fair shot at promotion. And there's a lot of work to do to provide concrete incentives to the State Department or within the State Department to improve those things. So with that in mind, I want to ask you all a few questions. So first, the findings in the report and your testimony to your experiences are striking and point to longstanding issues at the State Department. The GAO report demonstrates that people of color have lower promotion outcomes when controlling for education, experience, and other characteristics. My question to anyone on the panel is, would you say that the experiences of people of color and women at the State Department when seeking to advance professionally can be called discrimination or discriminatory? Feel free to jump in, any of you.
This is Jean Abercrombie Gwen Stanley. I feel very comfortable with the word discrimination, and I used it in my remarks. I too have specific recommendations that I included in my official remarks submitted for the record. Discrimination comes in so very many forms, and a lot of it starts with what is in people's heads about expectations. So you might call it unconscious bias, but since we all know what the rules are, it should not be. And I think certainly discrimination is very much a part of it. The decisions that are made of who to advance for a position, for a job, for training. And as I mentioned before, in the civil service, women do get a great deal of training. There's no complaint about that per se, but does that training lead to a job in the senior executive service? And that's where that disconnect happens.
Mr. Chairman, I would tend to agree with Gina. I do believe that there is discrimination at state. I think it really rests a lot with mid-level managers, and I do think that there is a lack of accountability for that sort of thing. But it is less visible than it was some 30, 35 years ago when I came into the Foreign Service, in that it is unsaid to the employee and yet felt. I had a lot of Pickerings and Wrangles who I spoke with, some of whom have resigned from the service, who have told me that they have been kind of forced to go back and talk about their academic credentials as a justification for why they should be there, when they have been kind of singled out by colleagues and supervisors because they're a Wrangle or a Pickering or a Payne fellow. I have been part of that process, that intake process for Wrangles and Pickerings, and I have to tell you that it is just as rigorous, if not more rigorous, than the oral assessments that are conducted by the State Department. And I believe that this is an unfortunate aspect of this kind of latent discrimination that one sees in the State Department.
And thank you. To my second question, so there's a much needed conversation um, that's happening at a critical time in our country's history, when people are taking to the streets in protest of racial injustice. The national security community hasn't stayed silent, making powerful statements on how the ability to protest and have those protests acknowledged and addressed is linked to our country's standing as leaders, as a leader among nations. To you, what does it mean at this point in history to have the national conversation on racial injustice, and what will it what will it mean for this movement to lead to change, not only in things like policing or law enforcement, but also in institutions that have not historically provided opportunities for women and minorities to advance?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's absolutely crucial, not just for the health of our own country, to have this kind of national conversation going on, but it's also incredibly crucial for us to conduct an effective foreign policy. No one expects America to be perfect. In fact, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, it's to form a more perfect union. And I believe everyone across the aisle, on the Hill and everywhere else, can agree that this is what we need to do right now. What is crucial is how we come out of this moment of inflection in America. If we simply bury it, if we forget it, if we move on, if we say this is done deal, or we just avert our eyes because it's so hard, it's going to make us weaker, not only at home, but overseas. It's how we deal with this now that matters.
I am struck that Pete and I use the same phrase in our prepared remarks, more perfect union. And that as minorities who've had to struggle more than most in this country, that we still so wholeheartedly believe in that possibility. I believe that seeing the struggles in the United States and knowing that they're seen all around the world is indeed going to make us reach for that higher standard. We were brought up to believe that we were the exceptional nation. We've got to live that. And I believe very firmly that African Americans, Hispanics, all of us are ready to do the work to get us there. That, I believe, I agree with Pete, that is the inflection at this point. America is saying enough across the board. All kinds of organizations, ours, the governments, private organizations, museums, etc., all coming to focus on this. Enough. We've got to get this right. And we can. It's not rocket science. We know what we need to do. We can.
Thank you, Ambassador. And with that, I'll pass it over to
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for interrupting. We are having technical issues again, and I wanted to let the members know about that.
Okay.
In terms of
we'll recess for just a few minutes to get that back on, and then I'll turn it over to Lee for his questions. Apologies, y'all. that. We're good to go. We'll see if Lee's there. There you go. Ready for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman. While the data shows that discrimination has impacted promotion rates in the Foreign Service, another important factor to recognize is the decision by many FSOs of color to voluntarily leave the service. We, of course, don't want to lose that talent. We want to keep them around so that they do apply for promotion and end up in senior positions. First, Mr. Baer, have you had an opportunity to look into that aspect yet?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. We haven't looked specifically at the attrition, kind of what's behind that. I would say there is data in our report that talks about the attrition rate, and I think, to your points precisely, there are concerns around attrition, but I think where we're coming from is there's some additional work that has to be done to understand what are the root causes there. Why are people leaving the State Department? And because that's when you can really tailor solutions to address those root causes.
Either of our other two witnesses or two ambassadors have any thoughts on that aspect?
I think we're both highly supportive of exit interviews, and hopefully that they are constructed in a way that people can feel and be honest about the reasons that they're leaving the Department of State. There's lots of anecdotal information. I know many people who have left, myself included. I know why people have left, and certainly the challenges of contributing to one's fullest ability is a huge part of that from my own experience. And the Department of State needs to be able to track that. The data is absolutely important.
Yes, Congressman, I agree completely with Gina. Look, nobody wants to look at exit surveys and interviews with people who leave, particularly those that leave early before retirement. This is a common kind of thing in most organizations. But I think it's absolutely crucial here that there be exit surveys done and that there be exit interviews done so that you can begin to identify the kind of systemic things that people are talking about. If one person leaves because they're disgruntled for whatever reason, and mentions why, well, that's concerning. But if 5 or 10 people, particularly women and officers of color, leave and mention the same kinds of things, you got to act on it. It's a pattern. You got to act on it. And I don't believe that state has done enough. What I've heard is from people who have left and left early, minority candidates or minority officers, is that they're given a form and basically you fill in your name and you check the box. Are you leaving because of pay? Are you leaving because of A, B, C, and D? And another box, other, so long. No questioning, no follow-up. Boom, done. And there just needs to be more done. And I know it's uncomfortable, but it's got to be done. There's no way around it.
Thank you. Mr. Baer, tables 40 through 43 of the GAO model assess a large number of factors related to promotion rates in the Foreign Service. It appears from the tables that having an Ivy League education may impact promotions. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share as to why that is?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and my kudos to you for getting to tables 40 through 43 of the report. I know we've got a lot of data in there, so I appreciate when people really dive into that. But yeah, as you referenced, for those who weren't able to get all the way to that level of detail, we have the results of the entire model that we built, which we included variables about the educational experiences of people and their promotion experiences. We were trying to model the promotion experiences, and so we're trying to understand the impact of education. And so what we did is we built that in, and we did find that there was a correlation between people having Ivy League educations, and especially early in their career, higher promotion rates or higher promotion outcomes.
Are you seeing anybody being discriminated against, evidence of people being discriminated against because they don't have an Ivy League education?
So here I have to be cautious because we very intentionally don't use the word discrimination in the report because that's a legalistic determination which we aren't prepared to make and wouldn't be supported based on the data analysis that we did. So I would say I couldn't necessarily make a definitive comment on that.
Okay, adversely impacted or any other way that they're, are you seeing evidence of someone um, uh, being targeted negatively because they don't have an Ivy League education?
I would say that what the results of the analysis showed was that there was a positive correlation if you did have an education and your likelihood of getting promoted relative to those who didn't.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, Chairman, we have a law in New York where they can't charge you more for using a credit card for gas, but they can offer you a cash discount. I understand what Mr. Bear is certainly saying there, but and again, thank you for having this important hearing on this always timely topic. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Zeldin. And I'll go now to Representative Liu of California.
Thank you, Chairman Castro and Ranking Member Zeldin, for holding this important hearing. Ambassador Romero, I was moved by your story. It reminded me of when I grew up in Ohio. On a number of occasions, very well-meaning people would come up to me and tell me that I speak English good. After a while, I would respond and say, thank you, I speak English well. So I have a question today about assignment restrictions, and it's to both Ambassador Romero and Ambassador Abercrombie Stanley. What I want to know is, let's say you're a Chinese American. Would the State Department not have you work on any issues related to China? Or if you're Mexican American and you're in the State Department, are you disallowed from working on any issues related to Mexico? Or if you immigrated from South Africa and you're in the State Department, are you prevented from working on issues related to South Africa? Or if you have family in those countries, let's say a nephew or a cousin, can you not work on issues related to those countries? I'm reminded of when I went on a congressional delegation with Speaker Pelosi to China, and we had a classified briefing before the trip. I remember we were in this room. There were about 12 presenters from different federal agencies. Not a single person was Chinese American, and I don't remember an Asian American in that room as well, other than me. And I thought, this doesn't seem like a very good situation. So just want to get your thoughts on that, whether there's a written or unwritten policy regarding assignment restrictions.
Congressman Liu, I don't know of anything written or even unsaid, and I'll leave that to be confirmed by Ambassador Winstanley. I think my experience has been the opposite is true, and that is that in the State Department, as a Hispanic, I kind of felt that people thought that I did a good job in Latin America because, that's who I am, and, Hispanic, working Latin American issues, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was kind of a discrimination, unsaid, unspoken, towards me working outside of the Bureau and my ability to be able to work outside of the Bureau. So I think in many respects, it's kind of the reverse. But I'll have Gina, she's got some more recent experience perhaps that can answer that.
I'll add to that, and you're making me smile. You're making me smile. In my incoming class, we had officers with foreign-born spouses, and each of those officers, one with a Japanese-born spouse, one with a French-born spouse, and one with not Japanese, South Korean and Chinese, and they all went to those countries. I have heard from close colleagues that the thinking in the department has changed and that people were prohibited from going to countries where they had close contacts. I haven't had certainly a personal experience, but many colleagues, and I have a bit of confusion about it because I know, I served in Tel Aviv and I had many friends and colleagues at the embassy with relatives in Israel that were not prohibited from serving there. So that's why I'm not sure about the facts, because I can only say my experience has been I've served with people at an embassy who had relatives in the country. So if there's something different going on, that hasn't been my experience.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know. I have a follow-up question regarding security clearances. Do you believe anyone at the State Department has more difficulties getting security clearances because of their race or ethnicity?
I would say yes, and it might be a question of security clearance and suitability clearance, because they're two separate things where people are looking at a range of issues as to whether that person is suitable to work, for the department. And depending on the familial connections, it might have an impact on one or the other. But certainly a very close look is given to those who have family outside of the United States, and even more so than simply travel outside the United States. I'm certain it has an impact.
Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Liu. I'll now go to Congressman Brad Sherman.
Thank you for letting me participate, although I'm not a member of the subcommittee. We talk about diversity and people will say it's better than the 50s, better than the 80s. Obviously, that's not the standard. People who bring diversity to the State Department will help us more than others because we'll have a foreign service that reflects America, but it will also undercut the propaganda of our enemies who say that America is a place of discrimination and caste. And obviously, nothing defeats that argument more than people high level in our State Department serving abroad and illustrating the opposite. Of course, if there is no diversity, we lead ourselves right into that. Those outside the world of foreign policy would think it would be helpful to have people in the State Department who understand foreign countries, who have ties to those countries, who speak languages as a native. Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley, are you saying that the State Department looks to somebody who says, my God, your parents were born in this country, your wife was born in this country, you speak this country's language, therefore we will not involve you in our in that embassy? Does the State Department actually regard it as a negative to have a better understanding of a country?
I don't think the department regards it as a negative with regard to understanding the question. I think the issue is concern about vulnerabilities, and I don't say that it's a valid concern. And I think our record shows that
vulnerabilities. Are you more likely to be mugged in a because
exactly.
you're?
There you go. There you go. Okay, we're on the same page with that. Yeah.
What are you vulnerable for? Because your wife was born in Japan, or your husband was born in Germany, or your parents were born in Laos, or that you speak Laotian as a native. What are you vulnerable for?
I would argue nothing.
Divided loyalty?
I am confident. Yeah, it would. Our diplomatic.
I think I'm frozen. Can people hear me?
I can hear you.
Hello?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
We can hear you.
Yeah. That
I don't know
there
if
is a
people can see me or hear me.
Oh, okay.
Hello?
Sir, we can hear you and see you.
It doesn't mean you're more able to hear me.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Okay, so the concern is that they might be more vulnerable, that they might be more easily compromised because their family is in the country. That is certainly what makes the department take a harder look.
Hello?
That is my understanding. So that's the short answer. And again, not one that I necessarily agree with, but that is the answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Congressman Sherman, did you have a follow-up? Are you there?
They can hear me. I'm being told by my staff that that you can hear me. So I wish I could hear you. I don't want to drag on the to take too much time. So I'll pose another question, and hopefully by the time I'm done with that one, there'll be some time to answer. The GAO reports of 89 and 2000 indicate that the State Department has not been successful in identifying potential barriers to hiring and advancement of minorities and women. And does it? Do we think that there are barriers in the State Department that go beyond the barriers in other departments of the federal government? Are there particular deficiencies at state that go beyond what we see in our society and in our federal employment? That's my additional question, and I'll leave whatever time.
I'd like to
You want to
take a
respond?
stab at that. Yeah. The Foreign Service, I don't know if the civil service is quite as opaque or quite as dependent on personal relationships, but you absolutely don't have a clear-cut way of knowing that you're going to get the assignment, or knowing, and promotions is a different category to which I can speak as well. But certainly on the assignments, those that are considered career enhancing, you've got to lobby for that assignment. It's not based on what you've done and how you've been rated or ranked before. You've got to lobby for it. You've got to have somebody in the room where the decisions are being made to say, I want X to happen. And so often, particularly minorities and women, do not understand how the system works. We do not have the same access to mentors and advisors to walk us through. I certainly didn't. I tell people I'd have been Secretary of State if I'd known how the system worked as far as my career was concerned. I had a lot of luck and people to tell me, no, in fact, assignment decisions are not made at post. So you writing a nice letter to the ambassador and the DCM and your predecessor, they're not the deciders. The decision happens in the bureau. You've got to push your candidacy in that, and so many people don't know that. So it is, having additional mentors, having additional information about how the system works will help women and minorities. I believe we do not have
just
the same access.
a few seconds. I've lived this since my wife is civil service at the
Okay.
State Department for over 20 years.
Uh-huh.
And there is a bar between certain positions and civil service. And I think that we would see more diversity in the State Department there. But there is this somehow this thinking that you have administrative people and they can only go so far and only in certain. You have civil servants; they can only do certain.
Yeah, as I mentioned. Yeah, it's true.
That those three separate casts in the State Department, I don't think are good for the State Department. I don't think they're good for bald white men who work for the State Department, and they're certainly not good for diversity at the State Department. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Sherman. Okay, now everybody's had a chance to ask the witnesses questions. We're going to go through a very quick second round, and then we'll go to closing. Just in terms of my question would be to any of the witnesses. I found that there's often points that the witnesses would like to make as they've heard the other testimony or the other questions. Are there any points that any of you would like to make during my second round of questioning that you haven't had a chance to make?
If I can take that, Mr. Chairman, if anyone ever wonders about whether diversity is important or not, I think I would hope that they would remember this story. I do a podcast called American Diplomat, and what we do is try to tell stories from our diplomats, personal stories. And there was a diplomat that we had on whose name I'll omit from this, but she is first generation, came over as a little child from Korea. Her uncle, her father did not make the trip, and she came to this country. And was exceedingly bright, went to school, graduated at the top of her class, came into the Foreign Service. I don't know whether she came in through Pickering or Wrangell, but she did come into the Foreign Service. Now she's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. But when she was working on the Korea negotiations, she was sitting in the room speaking fluent Korean. as a staff person. And it mystified the hell out of every single North Korean general at the table about who she was. And one of them came up to her at a break and said, "Sister, who are you?" And she explained that, yeah, well, my ancestors lived here and now they're living in the United States. And now I'm a diplomat sitting at the table. I can't think of a more powerful example of why this kind of diversity is absolutely important. That general had to admit starkly that we are a country that values the kind of talent that we do, and you can go through all kinds of barriers to get to the top. On another issue, real quick, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that the department would look at the issue of Pickerings and Wrangles. I've sat on those panels. Most of the Pickerings and Wrangles apply when they are graduating from undergraduate. They go through graduate school, which is absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, well, whether it's fortunate or not, I'm thinking that some of the demographics that Mr. Baer is looking at with respect to the GAO report and Ivy Leagues might be affected by the fact that a lot of these Pickerings go to Ivy League schools, to include Georgetown, which is, I think, probably the major supplier. So you'd have to kind of sort out for that. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is that our Pickerings and Wrangles come in at the age of 23 and 24 after they finish graduate school. In comparison to the rest of their cohort, their A100, their orientation class, the non-fellows are coming in at age 34 and 35 and older. What that means is that a lot of these people, and let's face it, Gina knows this better than anybody. You sing Kumbaya with all your A100 classmates. You're looking forward to this fabulous career together. But the bottom line is you're competing against those same people throughout your whole career. And if they've got 10 to 15 years of more work experience, there's got to be something that basically gives these young officers at 23 and 24 an ability to be able to go out, work in the private sector, come back, leave without pay, excursion tours to kind of season them in what's happening outside of the State Department, make them a little bit more savvy about exactly what Ambassador Winstanley was saying, and that is how to work in a large organizations, how to promote yourself.
So, Chairman Castro, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of highlight a couple of points, and I'll just be very brief. I think the first is, as Congressman Sherman very astutely mentioned, we reported back in 1989 on diversity in the Foreign Service, and now we're 30 years later, and we're identifying some of the same underrepresentation issues. This is not a new issue; it's a long-standing issue. And so this is really where we're coming at, from the point of you need to get to the root causes of what exactly is going on so you can design tailored solutions to address those. And you do that by peeling back the layers of the onion to understand exactly what's going on. And this is really where it's time to move from words on paper, commitments, to making tangible actions that you can assess to actually demonstrate impact for improving diversity and inclusion at the department.
Thank you, Mr. Baer. Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley.
Yeah, I'm going to second both of my colleagues, Ambassador Romero and Mr. Baer. Thank you for those. I associate myself with them fully. The bottom line for me is always accountability. And that pulling back of the layers and taking steps and getting down to the root of the problem. People won't bother to do that if they don't have to do that, even though it's best for the organization. I think people are inherently comfortable with the way things are and or lazy, both, I'm sure. Therefore, unless they're held accountable, in my evaluation for getting to the very top of the organization, what have I done? Have I made the effort? Have I overseen others? Am I responsible for making sure that work of getting down to what holds us back as an organization? And until someone is held responsible, we'll be here again, and we can't be here again. We cannot be here again. The American people are saying enough, enough. So whatever you do in the legislation, there needs to be a position next to who is responsible for X, Y, and Z, so that they have to answer the questions and have the incentive to make sure things happen for the good of the organization. I do want to say one other thing, Ambassador Romero's remarks about Pickerings and Rangos, and I would argue that one of the challenges that I don't know how public the department has been and about it is that those fellowship programs have in fact replaced, not intended, but in fact replaced the major intake of minority officers into the Department of State, that they come through the fellowship instead of coming through the regular process. It wasn't supposed to be that way. Our numbers are not increasing because people are not coming in the regular way. And those people would probably be of a similar age and experience. So you'd have a nice range of people coming in, as we always have. I came in at the age of 27. There were people who were 21 in my class, and there were people who were 36 in my class. So we had a full range. All of us are still in, by the way. So all of us have been, I'm not in, but until I resigned, all of us were still in and successful in the departments. I don't think age and external experience should be a barrier to success. I don't think that's the case. But I do think it's the case that we have somehow set in our heads at the Department of State, we're going to take brown people through these fellowship programs. And when we are assessing them, there's something in the assessor's heads that say, these people aren't good enough because they haven't come through this fellowship program.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I took a little extra time on my round of questioning. Ranking Member Zeldin, if you have any questions.
Well, Chairman, being that you do have two very distinguished diplomats here on this call for today's hearing, I wanted to give them an opportunity to reflect, share a story or so of their entry into the Foreign Service. Maybe not as much speaking to myself or us as members as that young man or woman who's out there looking to follow in your footsteps. So what kind of advice you have. Maybe a reflection, a story, and also some advice for them looking to maybe fill your shoes one day.
Thank you, Congressman Zeldin. If there was ever any advice that I had for the younger generation of officers, and thank you for this question, it would be that this is a long-term process. Don't let career dissatisfaction or what you're reading in the newspapers affect you. Stick with it. We need the very best. We need people who are resilient. I remember that I had an extraordinary career of promotions, but I thought I was going to die as an FS2, which was the mid-level. And I had a mentor of mine say, Pete, come on, get over it. Get over yourself. You need to be in the Foreign Service. The service needs you. And just that little bit of encouragement from that mentor meant a world to me, and I stuck it out. And in fact, within a matter of years, I found myself as Assistant Secretary of State. So what I would say is, again, stick it out. Be resilient. This is not necessarily all about you. It's about our country, and it's about representing our country with our very best. And ultimately, going back to what Gina has said, and that is that if state is going to talk the talk, Congressman, they got to walk the walk, and they've got to put things in place that make people, particularly mid-level officers and managers, accountable.
I do a lot of recruiting for the Department of State, and I'm a great recruiter. It is the best job in the world. We benefit from having all of us at the table, from whatever background, gender, sexual orientation. We need all of us to represent the United States. Any pain that I've experienced over the years has been more than balanced out by extraordinary colleagues, white, Black, Asian, otherwise, and extraordinary opportunities for myself and for those who are coming behind me. As Pete said, we are waiting for you. America needs you, and the organization needs you, and we are working today to make this happen. We do not want to come back and have this conversation again. So this focus, we're not going to lose this focus. Come join. Thank you.
Well, Chairman, thanks again for having this important hearing. Yield back.
Thank you. And Congressman Sherman, do you have any last questions? Maybe not. Okay. Then I'll go to the ranking member, Zeldin, if he's got any closing remarks.
So thank you to all of our witnesses for being here, for their perspective. This is a conversation that we're having here formally one afternoon in June of 2020, but it's one that comes with decades of your experience and reflections, and hopefully to follow years ahead, decades ahead of providing mentorship and ensuring that whoever is following us here in Congress or whoever is following senior leadership at the State Department and elsewhere, that we are always learning lessons and we're always pursuing ways to get better. The chairman hosted an extremely productive roundtable with leaders from many different areas of the State Department with very diverse backgrounds. I think it was fantastic to get everybody at one table to have that conversation, and this is really a continuation of that. I look forward to, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, hearing more about the diversity plan. Maybe someone from the State Department would be able to come to present that to the committee, to be able to answer questions. And really, this all should be a partnership amongst those who have the experience from the past, those who are currently in the field today, not just here in the U.S., but serving abroad, and also always looking towards the future to make sure that we are pursuing a more diversified State Department and other areas of the federal government that reflect the diversity of our country. So I believe that today's hearing and today's conversation, while it's a brief moment of one day, it is an important continuation of the chairman and this subcommittee's work on this very important topic. So thank you again to the witnesses and to the chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Zeldin, and thank you for your engagement also on these important issues. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for testifying again, Director Jason Baer, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, and Ambassador Peter Romero. As part of my closing, I'm going to read a few quotes from the Government Accountability Office. Quote, "The statistics on minorities and white women in the Foreign Service show that the State Department does not meet the criteria for representation. Quote, state has eliminated entry-level underrepresentation for Foreign Service officers. However, underrepresentation at the mid and senior levels of the Foreign Service exists," unquote. Quote, "According to state officials, hiring diverse classes at the lower ranks of the Foreign Service improves representation at higher ranks over time. Specifically, state officials noted that because rising from class 4 to the senior Foreign Service takes approximately 20 years, the diversity of the senior ranks should improve." The first two quotes were from the GAO report from 1989. The last one is from the 2020 report. Over 30 years later, the representation of women and people of color in positions of power and leadership has not improved very much. It's clear that having diversity at the entry level isn't enough, and that we can't expect the situation to improve on its own. We need real structural changes in order to make progress on diversity and inclusion at the State Department. For the people who represent America to actually be representative of the American people, diversity needs to be a long-term priority, backed by a commitment from the State Department leadership, the President, and also from the United States Congress. We've received many recommendations from the ambassadors on how to move forward, and I intend to turn those ideas into legislation. And as the ranking member mentioned, we also look forward to hearing from our current State Department, our current administration, on their plan for diversity. Today represents an important step in the right direction, but as you all know, there's still a lot of work to do. Thank you, everybody, and that concludes our hearing for today. Take care, y'all.